During the 90s console generation with the Sega Saturn and even the Sony PlayStation, there were definitely some very unusual and experimental games that saw the light of day. While many would hit great heights of success, others would do well in the grand scheme of things, but just wouldn't be considered good enough to reach greatness pretty much. But they did present very cool and unique ideas that for the time were pretty much ahead of the curve. Racing games definitely took advantage of these ideas, with some unusual mixes from arcade racing and even with off-road style racing that made use of different dynamics, gameplay features, while opting for a more arcade approach would still implement realistic physics in order to make it feel authentic, which was definitely a plus point. But in saying that, the majority of the games that did come out during this time probably didn't do as well as they would have first expected. But like I said, it was experimental, it was something different, and while it may not appeal to everybody, but it definitely appealed to specific types of players. Hardcore 4x4, also known as TNN Motorsports, Hardcore 4x4 in the US, and even with other names like Deka Yonku, Tough the Truck in Japan, would be one of these games to try these different ideas. The game was firstly released on the Sony PlayStation in 1996 and would later be added to both the Sega Saturn and the Windows PC. That would be developed by Gremlin Interactive, but would have different publishers depending on the region it was released in. That focuses on a series of off-road racing style events, utilising trucks as the main source for each event, where you race on circuits with different surfaces to contend with tarmac, dirt, sand and ice, where you can also select a variety of different trucks at your disposal that all have their own different handling characteristics, and the main goal is to complete the different modes and even the championships, even with the attempt to win the ultimate truck or the mother truck towards the end of the game. Now this truck can also be unlocked using cheat codes, and there's also a hidden cheat that unlocks another game known as Rides, which would be an Asteroids clone for those that like to explore and try to unlock certain hidden elements that would have been seen within these games if you knew how to do it. What was interesting about this game is during its development, because it was an off-road 4x4 style game, the developers would separate the wheels or suspension physics off into different sections so that they would respond independently of each other when traversing the environment. So in a lot of ways it had a lot of realistic elements, which was pretty cool. But in saying that, with regards to reviews, the game was limited in terms of its overall appeal, because the tracks themselves, while there was only 6 in the game, were very linear and limited all at the same time, because you couldn't go off the track at any point. There weren't any alternative routes, everything was pretty much straightforward. And while the physics were pretty cool to look at, over time if you're playing it, especially if you suffered with motion sickness at all, let's just put it this way, this game wouldn't be best suited to you if you had a niffy stomach, let's just put it that way. But still, like I said, it definitely appealed to certain types of players, more so fans of off-road racing. Now the reviews of the game were mixed. Some magazines gave it fairly decent reviews, while the rest were between mixed and average, with many pointing out the repetitive and limited gameplay and the lack of track variety meant that the game could get boring very quickly, and in some cases the tracks were quite narrow to a point that at certain points, especially if you were being chased or bombarded with other opponents on the track, you could easily get stuck or toppled over. And I found, even for myself, because I owned the PlayStation version back in the day and haven't played the Sega Saturn version, while it is similar even in terms of graphics, while I think the PlayStation might have had a slight edge on it in terms of its overall visual appeal, the Saturn, don't get me wrong, is still a worthwhile title to explore, but I found the gameplay to be a lot more difficult, or overly difficult, compared to that of the PlayStation, especially during the single player races. As with the PlayStation, through a bit of trial and error, you can win pretty much on every track, but no matter what I tried to do on the Saturn version, it was very, very difficult. A few of the races you were able to win, but the game just generally felt harder to deal with, because the AI opponents, if you made a mistake at all at the early points of the race, whoever was in first place would be so far ahead of you that trying to catch up with them would be impossible really. But even from the reviews, some of the main things that the game did have going for it, in fairness, would have been the likes of the suspension physics that did feel realistic for its time, but also the weather dynamics, which were quite realistic, that would change from the likes of sunny horizons to dull and overcast and even rain and thunderstorms, and in many ways did change the diversity of the track you're racing on, because it just felt different overall. And I think what helped too with the likes of the limited draw distance of the tracks themselves, with the pop-ups, the likes of the fog elements with the weather dynamics would help with the likes of traversing each track, because you couldn't really see into the distance until you were on top of it. So in many ways you could say that that also played into the limitations of the hardware itself to make it a little bit more appealing. But like I said, it wouldn't be for everybody. It will only appeal to a certain dynamic. Fans of off-road racers back in the day would have appealed to this. For me personally, because I owned the PlayStation version, I still played it and I enjoyed it for what it was, but I will admit there was times when you did find it would be repetitive, but you still find yourself going back to play the game, and the Sega Saturn edition would be no different. But it's an interesting title. It wouldn't be classed as the worst racer right there of its time, if anything. Yes, it has its limitations, it has its bugs, it has its flaws, like most games during this time, but it presented a lot of experimentation that in many ways did work, but just wouldn't have been enough for the game to really hit that mass appeal. In saying that, however, across all platforms, the game still did well revenue wise, generating over a couple of million, so it really can't all be that bad. But I think in my own personal opinion, I think it's definitely better played in short bursts. But I don't know, there's just a unique charm about it that I do find myself often going back to play it time and again. But there are some subtle differences between the console versions. Yes, the PlayStation might have been graphically a little bit better, but regardless of which one, at least with owners of the console, you had access to the game anyway. But even looking back, it's still interesting to look at these two games, play them and even compare them. Some will like it, some won't, that's totally fine. But it is interesting and it's reflective of its time period. But regardless of what I think of it, it will be more interesting to hear what your stories are of this game and what did you think of it back in the day. Were you a fan of the Sega Saturn version, or did you originally play this game on the PlayStation or even on the PC? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And this here is just but one of many unusual, interesting and experimental games that found their way onto these consoles and even with the Sega Saturn, and there was a lot more to explore, so it might be worthwhile checking out this next video to see what else the classic Sega consoles had to offer.